Welcome back home, church. I'm really happy that you're able to join us today. We're having to do something that's a little bit of an audible. Pastor Doug had a message prepared this week, but he's a little bit out of pocket, and I'm sure your leaders will go over that with you a little bit more, but he'll be back next week. So this week, I wanted to kind of fill us in with a little bit of a different message, something that's a little bit different than what we've been going over the past several weeks in Galatians. And that is the subject that to me just totally transforms what it means to be a Christian. And that is the subject of God's glory and how that impacts our lives. So what is glory? What does it mean to actually observe and to see God's glory? Well, God's glory, you can kind of think of it a lot of different ways. Theologians have all these crazy, definitions and, kind of interesting studies on how exactly you define it. But I would just simply put it like this. God's glory is understanding his supremacy over everything, that he is bigger and he is greater than whatever power that we can observe here on earth, than whatever thing we may think may kind of shackle us. His supremacy is greater than any nation that we're going to ever see, or have ever seen on this earth. God's glory is basically just showing how big he is and how small everything else is by comparison. So one of the things that's in some of the notes that your facilitator can go over with you is something that was in a book that Pastor Frank, one of my mentors, had given me. In this book from a guy with the last name Fromke, he goes through and he explains how a lot of people see the Bible and they see it in different ways, at least in terms of, where does the story start? Does the story start, as far as the meat and potatoes of the Bible, does it start where sin comes into the world? Does it start where man was created? Does it start at Genesis 1:1 in the beginning? Or does it start even before that? And what we end up finding out is that God created in Genesis 1:1, which means he already existed. That's a big thought, a little bit bigger than maybe it seems at first blush, because think about it. That means that everything that we know, that we experience, that we ever will experience is here. It's in this universe, this creation, right? But God's even bigger than that. And once we start kind of realizing that God isn't bound to just what we see and taste and feel and experience right here, we can start understanding that maybe there's something bigger than just what we see here. There's something bigger out there. There's something more to live for than just what we get to experience. That's what God is, and that's what God has for us. And so when we sit here and say, I'm dedicating my life to God, really what I'm saying is I'm dedicating my life for something that's bigger than the here and now. So a lot of kind of big theology kind of thoughts right there, but just boiling it down simply, because I live for God and because God exists for his glory, I live for something more. Now, after that last bit, I hope you're still with me. Like I said, glory is kind of a complex thing because it's just a word, and we say it all the time, but it's hard to define. So what does the Bible say about glory? What are different ways that we see God's glory exhibited through the Bible? Well, one of the ways that we see it is we see God's glory demonstrated through God providing salvation from earthly powers. You have God taking his people out of captivity in Egypt, and God using even the verbiage with Moses to say, you will see my glory here when you see how I conquer these people, when you see how I bring you away from this world superpower nation called Egypt, something you couldn't fathom doing on your own, but watch how easy it is for me. That's the first way. The second way we end up seeing it is we end up seeing it through like the actual existence of Christ. Christ is described as basically being the radiance of God's glory. That's what you'll read here in a second in the scripture. And again, when you look at it that way, you start saying like, wow, so Jesus wasn't just a lifeline. He wasn't just, a body to be thrown out there to be slaughtered. It's that Jesus was actually the embodiment radiating God's glory. And so when you look at it that way, you start saying, well, then what was it that Christ was doing on the cross? He was demonstrating God's glory and demonstrating that God's glory, that supremacy over everything we know, includes things like death. Now, once we start getting towards the end of the Bible, it doesn't just stop with things in the past. It's also things in the future. What we see in Revelations are a lot of things that kind of deserve its own study after study after study on its own. But one of the things you see in the beginning of Revelation that is fascinating is this vision that John has of the throne room of God. And in this vision, what you end up seeing in there is just this picture of the beauty and the glory of what it means for God to create this place where his presence just radiates and where everybody worships him. And when you look at this, you can't help but just be in awe at what this looks like and what this might feel like to experience at some point in time once we all pass on into eternity. And when you look at that really starts making it hit home. What I was saying before, that because of God's glory, we live for something greater than what we have right now. It's almost like investing. It's like investing for the future. You're willing to sit here and sacrifice a little bit of something now, or maybe just not indulge in something right now because, oh man, there's something so much better waiting for you there in the future. So as we've been going through this, a lot of times I've been sitting here talking about the fact that we live for something that's greater, in the future, something that we may not be able to tangibly see because we know that God's glory is there waiting for us. But how does this actually impact us in the here and now? These are all things that sound nice, and they're things that, if you sit here and you follow all the theology and the Bible talk and everything, you go, yeah, got it. That's nice. God is glorious. But what does that mean to me in my day-to-day life? Well, it means a few different things. The first thing it means is that understanding God's glory and the fact that God's glory is what it is, it helps us to keep our sin in perspective. You see, a lot of people who aren't Christians, or even people who are kind of newer Christians, sometimes they get this mistaken thought, and unfortunately, a lot of times it's given to them by other Christians, that Christians will assert that if you don't follow Christ, you're a bad person, and that's kind of, at least by earthly standards, not the case, right? I mean, there's tons of people in the history of mankind who have been what we would call decent people that weren't Christians. So, well, then what is the distinction there? Well, the distinction is actually in a weird way kind of that there's not a distinction, because what we read in the Bible is that all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. So you see, if the glory of God also includes like the perfection and the purity and all that kind of stuff of God that is just so crazy, then what we start seeing is that the only difference between a Christian and a non-Christian is that we recognize that we can't make ourselves more glorious. Like we can't do anything to achieve that same thing that God has. But that's why Christ came in, because Christ came in to die so that we might be able to join in that glory. And that's really what it's all about. That's why this discussion of sin and everything, as much as it sounds like shame, it's a happy thing. The other way that this ends up impacting our day-to-day lives is, besides just helping us to kind of keep in perspective, the fact that, we're really not all that different than other people, it also helps us understand, well, what I've been saying this whole time, that there's something more out there. So when we're sitting here and we have these opportunities to, succumb to whatever our temptations are, or things that we know we probably shouldn't do, or ways we shouldn't react to people, it helps us just kind of keep that in the back of our mind, to focus on the fact that God is asking us to live for a better life, because this is a way that we can share in this thing that's much, much better than what we can do on our own. So it helps us keep perspective on sin. It helps us to focus on, kind of keeping the straight and narrow and doing things that, will help us to be a part of this glory of God. So what's the last thing that I have for you? Well, the last thing I have for you is that God's glory helps us to draw closer to one another. Because think about it this way. If there is this thing that we all get to be a part of, and we know we're all going to join together and be a part of this amazing glory of God, then that is a tremendously unifying thing. All of a sudden, any other distinction that we may levy upon ourselves starts fading away. It starts becoming irrelevant if I'm from the north or if I'm from the south. If I'm white, if I'm black, it starts becoming, completely irrelevant if I'm rich or poor or anything else. Like, all these distinctions we draw start just fading away. And all of a sudden we start looking at each other as all being people who fall short in trying to achieve our own glory, but yet will we be unified in the body of Christ, and we'll all join together in a piece of that glory in heaven that we read about in Revelation. To me, this is just such a fantastic subject, talking about the glory of God, because it's something that even today, after reading it time and time again, it's hard to understand. I'm sure a lot of you guys are even, in the back of your head kind of thinking, I still don't totally get this whole glory thing. But the bottom line to us is to understand that the glory of God is not just this crazy abstract thought. It's something that does lead us to act differently. It leads us to act in a way where people can see Christ in us, because they see us living not for ourselves and not for our own glory, which falls short, but living for the glory of God. That's the message I have for you today. I hope there's something you're able to take from that. And until we meet again, just know that once again, and as always, we are praying for you guys each and every single day. God bless.